Okay, good morning everyone. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Brent Duckor. He is professor at the Department of Teacher Education in San Jose State University. He received his PhD at UC Berkeley. He studied quantitative methods, evaluation, educational measurement, and testing. He was a former high school teacher, so he's a practitioner. He knows what he speaks about this. He authored 2 books, Mastering Formative Assessment Moves and recently Feedback for Continuous Improvement in the Classroom. He's well connected to Eastern Central Europe. He was a Fulbright scholar in Hungary. He speaks Hungarian. So welcome, Professor Duckor. His lecture will be on feedback for deeper learning.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful for this opportunity. And you'll excuse me if sometimes my voice wavers, so I'll get some water. It's a great pleasure to be here at the university today. And I want to thank my host and the School of Psychology, first and foremost. The topic that I'm discussing turns out to be a very, very important topic, both practically for those who teach students, regardless of whether they are kindergarten teachers or high school teachers or even college lecturers and professors. Feedback is a ubiquitous, or we might say, very, very deep practice that most people who are pedagogues know something about. So some of what I'm saying today you'll know about and it might be familiar to you, and some of it might be new. What I'd like to do is give you a little bit of a background on some of the research that supports the use of feedback as a kind of practice in the classroom that improves student learning outcomes. There are many, many practices that we can talk about that make student learning more effective or deeper, but feedback is clearly among them one of the top foremost that have been identified both in research and just personal experience. The outline of today's talk will follow a set of themes. I want to first introduce myself. I want to say a bit about feedback and how we might define it, what we know from it in terms of the research literature about its effectiveness. And I want to also introduce today a new framework that my colleague Dr. Carrie Holmberg and I have established. So we published this book a few months ago, and it is the product of about 3 years of research on synthesizing the literature about what kinds of feedback strategies, tactics, and processes we can use in the classroom to advance student learning. I'll say something very quickly about an example that's very concrete, that helps us to think more, I think, practically about the work. And then, of course, I'll have a few remarks about what's sort of next as we think through the challenges of embedding feedback into our traditional classroom assessment practices. Well, first of all, by way of introduction, I've already had an introduction, so I'm pretty good on that. But I would point out, for those of you who are interested in my Hungarian background, tanár voltam gimnáziumban, Pécs, Magyarországon. Nagyon régen volt, majdnem 30 év ezelőtt. 30 év. So it was a long time ago that I was a teacher in this small high school. But what's interesting, I found out, Apáczai Csere János is a very famous Transylvanian, and actually is, as I understand it, buried somewhere close by here in Cluj, Kolozsvár. So I'm going to visit this place on Saturday, if I'm lucky. This was the name of the high school. It was a dual language high school. I had the opportunity to teach both in English and my subject area of history and philosophy with students who were quite fluent in English, so I benefited from that. I've also worked over the last 30 years on questions about teacher effectiveness, teacher growth, and teacher development in the profession. So most of my research focuses on how to improve beginning teachers' experiences with classroom-based assessment practices. As you can see, I have a little bit of more teaching experience. After I left Hungary in 1991, I then went back to New York City to obtain a master's degree, and I taught at a small school in East Harlem that turned out to be quite a famous, nationally recognized school. I didn't know it at the time, but it's the subject of much, much research, particularly in the 90s in the United States. There were fantastic outcomes for students who were relatively poor and who had other sorts of issues and concerns that we needed to address to be more effective to help them realize their educational aspirations and goals. And I was deeply formed by this experience. So I think of myself as a researcher today who benefited from being a high school teacher in Hungary and then making my way finally to Harlem before I went back for my PhD. So this is what are my values, I might put it that way. Currently at San Jose State University in California, I teach teachers as well as educational leaders. And so that means I'm quite close to what we call clinical practice. Teachers in the state of California have to take courses at the university for master's level programs, but they also have to engage in what we call student teaching. And I teach a course along with my colleague, Dr. Holmberg, that allows us to really help our teachers start to think about how they're going to engage in feedback practices to improve both their experience as beginning teachers, but more importantly, the students that they serve. The two books that I've written with Dr. Holmberg have focused again on assessment for learning. Most of us know about assessment as a kind of testing experience. Maybe it's a national examination. Maybe we're familiar with what we call standardized tests. But these two books are dedicated to the proposition that assessment is occurring daily for students and teachers inside of classrooms, departments, and schools, and that we ought to be more intentional, not just about how we prepare students for a test, but what do we do in between as they are preparing? What kind of feedback do we give them to improve their learning so they're ready to do well on the examinations or standardized tests that we give them? Well, it always makes sense when you have a talk to ask the question, what is the thing that you're talking about? And we're talking about feedback. Now, feedback, it turns out, has many meanings for many people. And if I was teaching a workshop with you, and maybe someday I'll have a chance to do that if I return, the first question I would have in a classroom is, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you see or hear the word feedback? That would be my question for my classroom of university students. And I would then take the time to walk around and write down everything that I heard my students say. And I would notice very quickly that there would be differences in terms of how people think of feedback. Some people think of it as criticism, being told that you're not doing something well. Other people think of it as a kind of attempt to redo or rethink something. Some people think of it as timely. Some people think of it as costly. It takes a lot of time and effort to give feedback. So there's all sorts of ways people think about feedback. If we Google search using the Ngram search engine, the history of the word feedback in the extant digital literature that we now have, we notice that the word feedback really didn't take off until quite late in the 20th century. The use of the word in psychology articles or in educational journals really is noticeably absent in the early and mid part of the 20th century. So we imagine that feedback in all sorts of disciplines, whether it is engineering, whether it's in science topics, or whether it's in education, is not getting too active in the universe, so to speak, until basically the late 80s, 1980s. Now, a lot of people talk about feedback in the higher education literature, and they don't always distinguish as carefully as I think we might. What makes feedback formative? You'll notice that almost every piece of my research and my writing always puts the word formative before the noun assessment or feedback. Formative assessment. To make the feedback formative, we have to think more deeply about how it is used, how it is taken up, how it is incorporated into the student's metacognition, for example, in terms of their ability to learn how to learn. So even the word formative is an interesting word because when you put it together in the search engine with formative feedback, the curve becomes even steeper, and it's very clear that formative feedback really didn't appear in the research literature and even the mainstream topics that this search engine is able to access until really the last 20, 25 years. So this is a relatively new concept and therefore a relatively new research program. For me, I like to think of it as the place where feedback works is when it is formative for both the student and the teacher, that both of them learn from the information that's being exchanged. We can call this the sweet spot. And some of you are familiar, probably, with the notion of the zone of proximal development that was developed by our famous social cultural theorist and learning theorist, Lev Vygotsky. So a lot of the work on feedback, in my opinion, rests on the foundation of Vygotsky's insight into how children and, I think, adults learn. They learn in relationship to others. They have mentors or experts who guide them. But over time, they become more independent in their learning. And we think of feedback as a kind of bridge that can be internalized over time. So initially, the teacher will be giving lots of feedback to the student. But over time, the student will begin to internalize these processes and give them self-feedback, even in the company of peers. Previous research on feedback is quite extensive. It, again, has been over the last 20 to 30 years. If we go back and we ask the question, who are some of the founding fathers and mothers of this particular research program, we would want to point to Roy Sadler from Australia. In 1989, Sadler was already talking in the Australian context about feedback, and he was thinking of it mostly as self-assessment at that time, utilizing specific standards in which students were given opportunities to close the gap on their current learning with what was expected of them to learn. So again, the word feedback appears even in these early articles. Rama Prasad, actually from the business school world, in 1983, also attempted to articulate for those who work with managers and workers and employees a kind of relationship that feedback could provide between the person who is managing and the person who is working or learning. And he noted that feedback is information about a gap between the actual level and the reference level of a system parameter. Now that's a very sophisticated way of saying feedback is about sizing up the relationship between where somebody is with a process or activity in a business setting and how we can move them or help them to go forward to improve their performance. And I think it's interesting, too, that Rama Prasad, I've read a bit of his work recently in a review that I'm doing. He doesn't mention Lev Vygotsky. He doesn't necessarily connect this to the zone of proximal development. But I would say that to have a rich conception of feedback, we should not only be thinking about information and its gaps, but we should really be thinking about the development of the learner. And there is where we pull on and pull from sociocultural theory in our education world. Again, just to remind everybody, Vygotsky had all sorts of important insights, and I think our feedback research should draw from them. It's critical that we think about feedback in a more interdisciplinary way. I want to also note that Bronwyn Cowie and her colleague Bell in 1999 had already began to conceptualize in schools the kinds of relationships that teachers and students engage in when they exchange information. I'm going to have an opportunity to see Dr. Cowie in New Zealand this summer. I consider her to be one of the foremost and important thinkers on this topic. And you'll notice that she has used these active gerunds to describe the activity of formative feedback as a process. There's the idea of noticing what students think. There's the idea of recognizing where they may be in a particular learning trajectory. And then there's the idea of responding to them. So we think of this as a kind of dialogic process. And again, this is at the root of what some of us call progressive education. That education should be more than a didactic experience of sit and get, as we call it, or as the professor or teacher telling the student to take notes and basically using the lecture mode for the pedagogical experience. There is room for that. That's a good thing to do for certain kinds of knowledge transfer. But there are other moments that we need to embrace. If we think about Dewey, John Dewey, or we think about Lev Vygotsky, or we think even about Piaget and his implications about how people learn. We want to engage people in more constructivist approaches. So this kind of a picture of a feedback cycle really puts at the center the student as the learner. Willem and Thompson in 2008 continued to follow up on the idea of embedding feedback as an aspect or a piece of the puzzle for what we call formative assessment. So if we're thinking about formative assessment as a domain of practice and knowledge, we note that feedback is mentioned, providing feedback that moves learning forward. So everyone notes that feedback is important. I decided to write this book with Dr. Holmberg because our goal was to actually go much deeper and unpack what we meant by terms like feedback and how teachers, students, and even educational leaders could begin to think more clearly and deeply about the multitude of practices that we might call feedback-rich. Last and not least, Carolyn Wiley and her colleague Leon, 2016, noted again that if we're thinking about the importance of feedback, we want to think about it as how to close the gap. And here again, we note the idea of descriptive feedback or peer feedback. These are strategies or frameworks upon which to engage students in improving their performance on a task, a classroom activity, a project, anything that has a longer life in assessment than, for example, a quiz or a test item. We like to think of this kind of work as not only dialogic and not only constructivist, but having to do something with a longer-term project of learning that requires deeper feedback exchanges. So why feedback? Because even if we know about the practice and we can define it and we can talk about it as an important part of good schooling, we still don't necessarily know if there's research to support its use. And it turns out that there is. John Hattie, a foremost leader in the work on breaking out and making sense of what we might call educational interventions, has already spoken and written about for almost 30 years and begun to rank, actually, what are some of the most effective evidence-based practices that we can engage in the classroom to improve student outcomes. And Hattie and Timperley in 2007 conducted what we call a meta-analysis, which is a kind of study of many studies. This should be familiar to those of you in the psychology department. And he found that there were powerful effects and that they were quantifiable, particularly when we think about the kinds of levels of feedback that can be offered in various sorts of settings. So these studies that he observed, there was a commitment to tasks and making the tasks clear and aligning them with learning criteria. The teacher knows how to do that. The teacher also would have been committed to processes of exchanging information that are visible to students, that are protocols and activities and even what we call graphic organizers that allow students to know where they are. Also, there's a commitment to self-regulation, not just co-regulation, but self-regulation, so that students have to understand and internalize some of the standards of practice as well as how to use the information, and when they're not sure, how to ask questions. So we have the evidence from studies, even coming up until recently, that feedback remains a very, very important part of what we might call an effective learning suite. I'll just notice again that only 3 years ago, prior to the pandemic, when we still were doing most of our studies in actual physical classrooms, and much of the research literature is tied to face-to-face interactions, we could say, again, similar things even in that time, that there were important effects in terms of feedback, uptake, and usage, not just in terms of academic achievement specifically, how people perform on standardized tests, but also in terms of cognitive and motivational aspects of improvement. Self-report, for example, on confidence. There's lots of studies that tell us that when students engage in feedback practices, they improve their confidence. So there are good reasons to be thinking about and using this kind of work based on the evidence that we have. Now again, I noted that much of the literature was based on pre-pandemic study. And all of us who are in this room have noticed that during the pandemic, we went online. And many of us worked in other media to learn. So the question for me remains today, what do we know about feedback in online settings? What do we know about feedback in blended settings, for example, like today's talk? And I think that's an area of research that we're going to have to push forward into. I had the good fortune, in my opinion, to teach online for the first time ever. I learned quickly. It took me many months to improve my practice as an online instructor, but I did use feedback strategies and protocols that helped my students to improve, I believe, based on their self-report about what was effective for them, what kinds of feedback, what kind of channels or modes was I providing. We used Google Docs. How many of you are familiar with Google Docs or Google Drive? Yeah, most of us. So you can give an assignment to a student and the professor can actually add comments onto the actual response, and so can peers. And so when we think about even peer or teacher-driven feedback, there are opportunities and possibilities in these new virtual environments that we might not have thought about when we were focused mostly on face-to-face learning. One thing we noticed that a lot of the literature has focused on corrective feedback. For students, that can feel often, again, like criticism or being told what to do or being told that's wrong, do this. Corrective feedback, of course, has a mixed review in the literature. There are positives and negatives depending on the domain, the subject area, and perhaps even the student characteristics. So we have to be careful that we don't think of feedback as merely corrective, telling somebody what to do, but rather we think of it as a more complex or nuanced involvement where you're giving enough support, let's call them next steps for a student to engage in. You're not overwhelming them, but you're also allowing them to self-regulate about how much improvement they can make so that they feel motivated to make those changes. So there are lots of challenges, though, nonetheless, even though we know a lot about this research and we have a good sense of what makes a difference, and maybe we have a good sense of the facets and aspects of feedback that teachers can be taught to pay attention to, and even more importantly, co-construct knowledge with us as researchers, there are limitations. And so one of the things I'm working on going forward past today's talk is really beginning through the framework that I'm going to show you in a moment, articulate for both researchers and teachers a way to pay attention to what we should be understanding in terms of the developmental needs of our research subjects, particularly in my case, our teachers and student teachers. How do they grow in feedback practices? How do they become more expert? And do they face certain kinds of constraints or limitations or what we might call bottlenecks that stop them from making the leap forward we would like? I always say, if ZPD is good for students, then it must be good for teachers too, because everyone is learning to improve their practice. So by thinking more deeply about how to observe and measure and evaluate some of this work, we might be able to improve our attention on what matters most. I'll say a few words now about the formative feedback framework, which my colleague and I have essentially synthesized out of our review of many frameworks. These are the ones that we think are the most important, particularly if you're talking and working with teachers directly. I think we can get a consensus immediately from the literature, and our framework builds on this consensus, that feedback always starts with the positive if it's going to be formative. It uses specific non-judgmental language, so that means when the teacher writes something on a paper or communicates something verbally or even uses a gesture, they are trying to do that in a way that is non-judgmental so that it won't be felt like as a form of criticism. Also, we know that feedback can be overwhelming, so we try to target one or two what we call next steps. Again, the idea of small areas in which a student on a project or a task can make an improvement. And then we think about always providing the student an opportunity for revision. I think we all know as lecturers and teachers that we have a lot of students. Some of us have 150 students, some of us have 500 students. It depends on the size of the course we teach. And many people who are teaching can feel overwhelmed by giving so much feedback and expecting to have to grade it again, so to speak. Many people like to give a test and then they don't look at it again. They just look at the result, they report it, they're done. Some professors in a science classroom might enjoy teaching their students how to conduct an experiment, and they might give feedback informally and have a final assignment. but they don't necessarily say to the student, you can improve in these areas and give it back to me again in 2 weeks so that I can get myself another grade. So this idea of revision, how much revision can we and do we expect inside of educational settings? I would note that everything I've said here would apply to any form of adult collaborative learning in any institution, whether you're at a government agency, whether you're at a business, whether you're at a school. These are in some sense 21st century skills. We all work on projects. Those of us in this classroom might be working on our dissertations, and we expect feedback, and we get feedback, and we even get from our professors the invitation to revise. I've never met a professor who's working on a dissertation who doesn't say, you need to rewrite this section, or you might improve your literature review. These are comments that are made for continuous improvement until 6 years, hopefully, you finally finish your dissertation and you can say, this is my summative assessment. This is the summative evaluation of my work. Here it is. But all the way through that process, there was formative evaluation and formative feedback. And you might not even have been aware that that's what it was. So I don't think it's too big of an ask, and I think it's universal in many ways if we just think about how people learn and work together. Our framework focuses on feedback as a usage theory. We like to think, of course, of there is no feedback unless we have identified the tasks, the projects, and activities that we're working on in a classroom learning environment. Every classroom has learning goals embedded in it. Sometimes they're called objectives. Sometimes they're called skills. Sometimes they're called standards. Sometimes they're called competencies. Every single classroom has that. But also, we want to think about the context for the learning, because even if we have all of this well-defined, we need to think, are we in a face-to-face situation, a blended learning environment, or a distance learning, which is completely online? Once we have some control over those context variables, we then parse it into 3 major ideas, 3 major what we call lenses. The first lens is directionality. Feedback can be given from a teacher to a student. We call that teacher-driven. Secondly, we can think of feedback as peer-to-peer, when students work in pairs, small groups, and they actually are working together on something and giving each other feedback. And thirdly, we think of self-driven feedback. That's when someone says, I need to work on this part of my literature review today. I still haven't obtained a good sample of literature going back at least 30 years. I've focused on the last 2 years. I'm going to have to work today specifically on a search for the following information. To me, that's self-driven feedback. That's, I know what I have to do and where I need to go next. You can think of these as foci, and these are the lenses. The second major lens is configuration. So when we observe feedback practices, as well as when we invite and elicit them and construct them, we can think of feedback as a whole class experience, with the teacher pushing feedback out to the entire classroom, whether it's 30 students or 150. The idea is the teacher's driving and configuring the feedback for the whole class. We also see feedback, and we have research on feedback in which students in small groups are working together to provide each other a different kind of feedback than they would do, for example, one-on-one individually with their own instructor. So even if we think of the configurations of feedback from an observational research standpoint, we want to untangle what's going on in terms of, does feedback change, or do ways in which people provide information to each other change based on the configuration? And if so, what does that tell us about what's less effective and more effective to move the students forward? Last but not least, this is one that we're very excited about, the modalities of feedback. Now, the literature talks a lot about written feedback, and they've studied how teachers and faculty give up processes of written feedback, for example, in a literature program where students are writing. And so the teacher will put feedback literally. In the old days on a piece of paper, today it might be a digital comment. Spoken feedback, that's the verbal. That's what we do all the time, and we think of it as kind of almost an innocuous or an invisible practice. It's so common you can't even see it. But really, a lot of teachers know how to provide spoken feedback. And they can do it in a one-on-one setting, for example, a meeting with a student. They can also do it in small groups by circulating around the classroom. In science labs, in high schools in the United States, we see all the time the teacher moving around, checking on each station to figure out whether or not students are in fact themselves providing feedback or getting a little push to do it. This one here, nonverbal, I think is one of the most important and under-researched pieces of the feedback literature. This refers to what we might call body kinesthetic skills and knowledge, as well as what we might think of as haptic. It turns out that not everybody teaches math. Not everyone teaches math and science. And yet much of the federal money in the United States goes to improving teacher work and teacher teaching in the areas of math, science, and other STEM subjects. Well, as a former high school teacher working with colleagues, I noticed that I had friends who were PE teachers, physical education, art teachers, music teachers, and I noted that those teachers were excellent at giving nonverbal feedback. That is, they use gesture and body position, and sometimes even put their arm, for example, if a student was playing tennis or badminton, use their arm and touch to improve the position. For music teachers, we see them coming up to students sometimes and asking them to lift their chin, but not using words. Sometimes it's words spoken, sometimes it's nonverbal. So the idea that feedback is only written or spoken is a misconception. There is, in fact, a role for nonverbal feedback in an exchange with our students. In traditional subjects like history that I taught, and economics and civics in high school, I didn't use a lot of nonverbal feedback explicitly because I was in a traditional classroom setting. But we do even see there that some teachers are quite good at communicating with their students in a way that makes the students feel comfortable. And some of that is verbal and some of that is nonverbal. So this is the basic framework. We go through it chapter by chapter. It looks like that slide got crunched because we moved it from my Apple Mac to this platform. But there is a nice printout that's available actually from the book for free, so you can go online and find it. I just want to say a few quick words again about directionality, because this kind of visualizes it. We have the self-driven feedback, the peer-to-peer feedback, and we have the teacher-driven feedback. And again, each of these particular directions can be studied and can be improved. That's important, because I think sometimes in the literature, we haven't seen enough real differentiation about what's making a difference. Is it one of these particular types of directionalities, or is it a combination? And we might even think about studying that if we had measures of each. So one of my aspirations for the next several years is to develop measures that we could use to observe actual teaching, and with those measures begin to give improvement feedback. To do that, I think we would need to handle the question of the facets and aspects of this particular construct or domain. Again, we have to think about configurations in terms of interpersonal dynamics. Anyone who's taught will know some students enjoy talking. I was one of them. Some students don't enjoy talking in class. So we have to reach both students, and we have to give them opportunities to collaborate in ways that give every student a voice. That can happen sometimes more easily in individual groupings. It can happen sometimes when we have 3 or 4 students working. In the whole class, it can be a real challenge because we know often the feedback uptake is most recognizable when 1 or 2 students raise their hand out of 35. And we might think that the feedback has been understood or interpreted well, but we actually don't have a real good sense of how many of the students are able to utilize it. So again, I think the answer is to think about this as like almost a palette that we're painting on. We have all these different possibilities, and how can we construct a lesson or a unit of instruction where we take into account these aspects that can be used to advance our students' understanding of the feedback we're offering. The modality, again, focus on that nonverbal communication, right? I think it's funny, this little boy has his tongue out. He's giving us some verbal communication and nonverbal communication. But the point is that feedback has to be thought of as more than just the written comments a teacher gives to me. And even the conversation I have with my advisor. Feedback really should be thought of as a suite or a set of things that we can do to advance our understanding of the project. Feedback builds and creates the conditions for dialogue, trust, resilience. And again, this is a non-traditional way of thinking about educational goals and pedagogy, because most of us who are in the business of transferring knowledge to students would be thinking less about feedback and more about the delivery of the content and the coverage of the content so that a student would have access to this body of knowledge in a relatively quick, efficient amount of time over the course of a semester. The challenge for me is that what I saw at Nefco in Hungary, as well as what I saw in East Harlem in New York City, was that some students do much better when they're given opportunities to take more ownership over their learning and do what we call project-based learning. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the term project-based learning, but you can think of it again as a science lab. That's when a student and a group of students are doing a project, and they might be collaborating. Project-based learning has many... Project-based learning has many, many, many features, and you can even Google it if you'd like, project-based learning, to see whether or not you can learn more about it. I invite you to think about it because it is, in fact, a practice that is an important part, I think, of modern education, particularly if we're preparing children for 21st century living, where they're going to go to work and have to do projects, and where they're probably going to go on to college and do projects like master's theses and PhD dissertations, among other things. So I'm sorry. So feedback is actually a practice that centers us mostly on communicating and exchanging information. It helps us to engage in multiple forms of exchange, and it really allows us to think about closing the gap on learning in part by giving concrete next steps that are positive and actionable, so that our students can actually move and revise into the next phase of their performance. This concrete example that I'm going to show you now is called a progress guide. We found that many teachers know what feedback is. They can give us a definition, a declarative piece of knowledge about feedback is the following. But when we move to the application stage of their knowledge in Bloom's taxonomy to higher order thinking about feedback, we have to give them something that's more concrete, accessible, and usable. And so we came up with the idea of a progress guide. And we do this work because we want teachers not just simply to know about feedback, but we want them to engage students in using it for themselves to apply their knowledge. So we always have a task in mind. We then develop the notion of a progress guide, which I'll show you in a minute, and we look at samples of student work. One of the most exciting things about feedback as a cognitive activity is that it helps to build schema for the actual teacher. Because the more the teacher sees the patterns of responses that students have, the more this teacher can actually find ways to what we call bin or identify or categorize where students are. So we want to always look at the sample of student responses. This is from a research project that we did in Oregon State. This was for a 6th and 7th grade unit that teachers were using with their school district, where they had read about the Dust Bowl and they were being asked to identify the causes of the Dust Bowl. This is a great crisis that happened in the United States. It was about environmental climate change, and it occurred such that people had to leave states like Oklahoma and head west to go find more arable land. So the idea is this is a very relevant problem to today, and we think a lot about climate change. And the students were invited to just try to speculate, based on some evidence, about if they thought that the Dust Bowl was a quote-unquote man-made or human-made problem, or whether it was more the result of natural factors. We've got a range of student responses that we coded and transcribed, and I'm putting up here actual authentic student responses. Now imagine in a classroom as a teacher, if you want to give formative feedback to these students, that one student wrote this and another student wrote that. You can see quite a difference. It's like nooit kulamshake. There's a big difference between the levels, right? How do I give feedback that's effective and useful and positive to this student? And how do I do it for this student here? And if I have a range of student performances, I'm going to have to think about my feedback being differentiated. It can't simply be one size fits all. So we came up with the idea of allowing us to identify and what we call bin or categorize those many, many responses into a variety of possible outcomes. Now this is actually for the students. They used this particular tool, the progress guide, to actually identify where they were based on the response, the first response they gave to this assignment in a 3-week unit. And they, for example, might say, well, I can restate the problem. I can write down what we're supposed to answer today. But they have to think about what their next step improvement is. That's the real question. They themselves, doing a self-assessment or self-regulation activity in the classroom, have to find out first, with the help of their teacher and classmates, where they are, and then they have to think about 1 or 2 concrete next steps. And some students wrote, I have to reread, or I have to watch a video, or I have to ask the teacher. Some of the more sophisticated students would say things like, I need to give 1 more piece of evidence from one of the primary sources that we had in the class. So really, again, this idea of the student can be met where they are to differentiate their learning. This is a very important piece of the puzzle. The teacher, using the exact same guide, can look at the pattern of responses across the entire class and quickly identify who is exemplary in their first response, who is advanced, who is developing, who is emerging, who is beginning, even those students who actually didn't write anything. Now that's the big aha, that we differentiate the outcomes in terms of an initial, we could say, calibration of student understanding across the classroom, not in terms of who did well and who didn't do well, but actually in terms of where people may be in their current trajectory of learning. These percentages are literally from the teacher looking at the responses and over lunch quickly sorting them. And in her mind, coming back and saying, now I know for tomorrow where I need to focus and who might need some more support. Zone of proximal development. I don't know how else to think about zone of proximal development concretely in the world of teaching and learning unless I have real tools, as Vygotsky would say, that are socially shared and that can be used to construct language about what we're doing, as well as thinking about how to improve our performance. TBD means to be determined. The teacher had not yet, in this case, figured out all the different next steps that she was going to offer. But we have examples from research we've done in a couple of school districts nearby that teachers can actually fairly quickly figure out what they want to say the next step should be in general for students who may be at these different levels. Here's an example of an actual concrete identification of a level. Students who are advanced, and you can see here the hash marks, that's how many students were advanced. They can add some evidence, but they're not yet ready to go further and weigh and evaluate that evidence. They can't really answer the question, what were the causes of the Dust Bowl, and use evidence to say this cause is more important than that cause because of scientific research. They're not quite ready for that yet. We wouldn't expect it for 6th and 7th graders, but we would expect it for college students, by the way. We would expect them to be able to evaluate on a higher level. But we're at least introducing the idea of helping students go a little further. And again, these are the real responses. And then the question is, what does the teacher think about for next steps? And this is one example of a next step. The teacher might invite several students at this level to highlight the evidence you have so far. Use different colors to identify where the primary sources are and the secondary sources, or even the types of media. This was an article, this was a video, this was some other piece of information, a handout we got from class, so that students can begin to think about where is the evidence base. And there's even a very simple request, just reread one of the best responses that I showed you when we started this unit. It's called an exemplar, and take a look at what somebody last year did when they were constructing their response, and notice some of the things that they did. So again, these are very specific and very focused types of feedback. They can't be done for every assignment. We don't believe that every teacher and every assignment and every unit of instruction can do this. So we think of it as signature assignments. If you've got a very important assignment that you think is a culminating assignment in 3 months, maybe do this for that assignment, so that at least you can get some traction for your students on how to approach feedback and improvement. Quickly, example B is a peer-to-peer example, and it was about an acids and base response from a unit test that middle school students in Kentucky, another state, had done with a project from our colleagues at UC Berkeley, my alma mater. This project was called the CPUP project. And it was really a project where the National Science Foundation had funded UC Berkeley researchers to help school districts in Kentucky start to think about how to use what they call scoring guides. And the idea was most teachers were in the habit, when they did classroom assessment, of giving a quick set of points to a student response. 0 points for incorrect, 1 point for partially correct, and 2 points for correct. So that's the kind of grading schema that the teachers typically had. This project invited the teachers to grow into a more differentiated approach, an approach where they thought on multiple levels and possibly points to go with it. But you notice, for example, that it's more specific. The reason you're assigning 3 points is because the response was complete and accurate. The reason you're assigning 2 points is because it contains at least one major conceptual error about the relationship between acids and bases. And of course, only 1 point was for someone who tries, who attempts it, but they have more than a minor error or misconception. So this was an attempt to push the teachers further, and they actually did. They began to stop using those answer keys and moved into the scoring guides. And the students now, when they came back to the teacher and said, why did I only get 2 points? The teacher could say, well, you had at least one major error. Let's take a look at how you can improve it. And then the student could say, okay, can I turn it in 2 weeks? And sometimes the teacher said, yes, you can. But you're going to have to improve your work if you want that extra point. So the CPUP curriculum, again, had some very sophisticated content, content that was relevant, accessible. The teachers were using multiple methodologies to engage the students in the science units. But they also were committed to giving students feedback before the final grading period. And I think that's one of the things we can learn from this particular example. The standard of understanding chemical reactions and applying them to real-world problems is one of our national standards. So basically, we know that you can have rich curriculum, high-level learning standards, but most importantly, you can add into it something that gives us a way to get very concrete and very specific with our students and our teachers about improvement. Task prompt, and then we get the scoring guide. And in this particular scoring guide that was developed for the project with teachers' input and help, we have actually 2 basic domains or aspects of improving your understanding of issues, evidence, and you. One was recognizing relevant content, and the other was being able to think about applying relevant content. So if you want to watch this or see how it's done, I invite you to think of looking at the book. There's actually QR codes in the book, and everywhere where we have a QR code, you have an opportunity to watch real practices of real teachers doing this work. In closing, let me just say that whether we're using progress guides or scoring guides or any other concrete graphic organizer to help students see the visible aspect of feedback, we want to make sure that it has some kind of common task framework. So we need to have collaboration. We're going to have teachers talking to each other a little bit more. We also want to think about the idea of a shared project, a signature assignment, a big project. Let's call it a science lab where we want students to form a hypothesis. We want them to collect data. We want them to use a methodology. We want them to evaluate the results. That's the kind of project we're talking about, and we want feedback to be a part of that process. Useful formative feedback is going to always rely on looking at student work, because we as teachers and pedagogues can't improve our understanding of assessment for learning if we don't understand the variation in student thinking. It's very hard then to give differentiated feedback. These guides can be thought of as tools that can be co-constructed. They don't have to be given to us by the Ministry of Education or a testing company or somebody else. We ourselves as teachers in departments can build these kinds of things for common use, and we should. The grain size is one I want to leave you with today. It's critical that whatever feedback we give meets the students where they are, and that we're in a position to help them go further with these kinds of tools. The sweet spot again. How do we connect formative and summative assessment? That's for my next talk, perhaps some other day. But that's a critical issue for many people who work in the field that I work in, which is educational measurement and testing. How do you develop a link between classroom-based assessment practices and more traditional standardized tests? If you want more resources to learn, the book is available online. There's some free content there. And it's organized by chapters that tell you, for example, about the research. So if you're a student here in this audience and you're thinking about feedback, you're just going to want to find all of the references in the back, because those references will give you all sorts of information about the latest things that we know about this field. There's a glossary as well, so if you're doing work in English and you're thinking, I want to use some of the terms in English and better understand them, including ZPD and how I define it with my colleague, please take a look there. Thank you very much.